So anytime we get into the summer months where you're dealing with vegetation, and it can be any lake, it doesn't necessarily have to be a lake that's a shallow, grassy everywhere type of lake. This works in those places as well, but it's any lake where grass grows up. When you get in those areas, whether it be lily pads or milfoil, some of your spaghetti grass, anything that kind of grows up and clumps up and will hold bass, this is a really effective technique. It's just overshadowed by a lot of other techniques that people like to use in and around vegetation. It's basically a cross between a punching rig and a drop shot. I know that sounds odd. When you're in vegetation, if you look at the difference in these two rods, this is a finesse rod. This is a medium light extra fast rod, and this bait casting rod is a medium heavy, and it's also about 3 inches longer than this drop shot rod. A lot more backbone. Because you're going to be in vegetation, you need to stay on a rod that's going to give you the leverage you need. And also you need to keep in mind your line size. So if your line on my drop shot, I'm 8, 6 or 4 pound test on my leaders. This is 65 pound braid. So somewhere in there you can find a rod that's going to work for this technique. It doesn't necessarily have to be a big thunder stick like this thing, but you are going to want something in a bait caster that has more backbone down here and is going to be able to leverage those fish out of that vegetation, because you're basically, in this technique, you're giving every advantage to the fish, and so you need every advantage in your corner to be able to get those fish out of those areas. Let me rig this up and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So fishing around vegetation, everybody's pretty much got their favorite technique or their favorite thing to try or their favorite baits. Either you're frogging on top or you're trying to penetrate that vegetation. This technique will work with just about any soft plastic you have. You can go with something in a swim style bait that's going to sit out there and look like a wounded minnow, let's say. You can use just a Senko. Little rubber frogs. This is a Lunker Hunt product. Cool little frog, and it's got them stiff legs, so when it's suspended there, those legs are going to flap. That's the one I'm going to go with. And then just a larger traditional drop shot bait, something that you can Texas rig, but it's still going to have enough action in that tail in the back. A myriad of soft plastics that'll work for this, because you're going to be using a rod of some sort with heavier line. Now what this is my jig rod. I've cut my jig off. This is 20 pound fluorocarbon. I think that's good enough to accomplish what I want to do, so that's what I'm going to go with. You can do this technique on braided line if it's pretty thick stuff, and especially these lily pads. Braided line's a great option because it'll cut through those pad stems. The next piece of the puzzle is going to be your hook. You do not want to go with too light wire of a hook. Something in a straight shank. I believe this hook is a Mustad grip pin. It's just a straight shank hook. Got a lot of meat to it where a fish isn't going to really be able to straighten that out. If you hook a 5 or 6 pounder in this stuff, you've got a fight on your hands. So the next thing you want to determine is what depth of water is that vegetation in. If the vegetation's in 5 feet, then you can run a leader up to 3 feet long. If the vegetation's only in 3 feet, then you only want to run about a foot, foot and a half leader. You got to figure that every other guy on the weekend has come through here and punched and punched and punched, or jigged and jigged and jigged, or frogged and frogged and frogged this water. And what you're trying to do is show them something different. Sometimes that's all it takes to trigger a strike. So I'm going to take about a foot and a half, let's start with. And it's just like rigging a drop shot. You're just doing it on much heavier equipment all the way around. A single overhand, just doing a Palomar knot just like you would if you tied a traditional drop shot bait. A little bit tougher just because it's thicker line, but just kind of work it down without putting a bunch of loops and kinks in your line. Once you got it pretty close, wet it, cinch it, and now again, just like you would on the old traditional drop shot knot, come right back through the side wash from the point side, right back through there. That down. Now the last piece of the puzzle is you need a drop shot weight that's going to penetrate this stuff. So you're talking ½ ounce minimum. I'll go up to a 3/4, but also a 1 ounce is a great option. All I'm going to do with this thing is just Palomar knot it on. So simple Palomar to attach the weight. I'm just going to trim that little piece off. Now once you've picked your soft plastic and you go to rig it, you just rig it like you would a pitch and flipping bait. Get it in that nose, Go kind of just past the barb, just enough where you can get the eye in there. Come out the bottom, slide it forward, get it up past that pin, roll it over. And then this guy's kind of stubby, so this is going to be a little tricky, but all I want to do is bury that hook point in his butt. And if you push past the barb, it's going to hold there. But now you're dealing with this. Now you got something, you got your weight at the bottom, and suspended up off the bottom, you've got this little critter. So it's the PortersYT. It's just heavier duty stuff, but in a drop shot application. So heavyweight, big shank hook. This is a 1/0, 2/0 would work. Depending on the size of your bait, you can go to a 3, a 4, a 5/0. It's completely up to you. This is 20-pound fluorocarbon line. You can use braid. I would start at a minimum of 30-pound test on braid and go to 65. You can run a magic marker up and down your braid if you want to blacken out the line a little bit more. But this is going to be more of a reaction type of a strike. That thing's going to come through the vegetation, and then it's just going to be sitting there. And it's usually a pretty quick bite. But if they're being finicky, kind of like they are today, it's another option to get it in there and then just kind of bounce that thing and just let it sit and see if those fish come to you. Let's pitch it a couple times. I'll show you what that looks like. Another advantage to starting with a little bit longer leader, like this 1.5 feet, roughly 2 feet, is I can cut that weight off, drop it about 6 inches, and retie. And another advantage to this is if you've got a lake that's got a really muddy bottom, you might be letting that weight go down, sink in that mud, and then your bait's suspended just above that mud line, and then that can put it right in their face. A lot of advantages to this. It's just something that a lot of people, even including myself, forget to do. Just like pitching, is you just want to swing that weight out. Let that weight take your bait down into the pads. Bounce it if you have to, do whatever you need, kind of work it down in there. It's a little trickier than your traditional pitching rig. You kind of tapping it, just bouncing it like you would a drop shot. Not a lot of action to it, just kind of give it some taps and just letting it sit in their face is the big thing. And then bring it out and do it again. As you get better at this, if you just kind of tap your spool when that's heading for the pads, it'll slow that weight down. They'll kind of go in on top of each other. That's ideal. You know, if you get a situation like that where your bait's kind of stuck out of the water and the weight went down in there, just bounce it. If it's deep enough, eventually that weight will pull your bait through. And all that commotion right there, especially in the summertime, it's just not a big deal. It'll actually attract the fish versus spooking them. You know, it's a great technique for just around the edges too, where you can get out here. It's not as difficult to get that bait where you want it. And again, you're just suspended in that grass. It's a different look. The primary reason for doing this is just to show those bass something they're not used to seeing in an area they're not used to seeing it. Everything everybody throws in here typically goes through and goes right to the bottom. And this just sits right level in their face. Now, different than a pitching rig, I'm not going to send this way back in there, because as you send it out like that, and every single time your bait's going to get stuck on top of the pads. What I'm looking for is closer to the boat, is to find a spot within 6-8 feet, maybe 10 feet right out here, and then try to plop that thing in there. End with your rod high and kind of let that bait flop down in there. There it goes. So right off the bat, this leader's a little long for the depth I'm in, so I am going to shorten it up. Okay, so same concept. It's just a little bit shorter leader now. One, that weight's going to have an easier time pulling that bait through. And two, I'm only in probably 2.5, 3 feet of water right here. So I'm still going to be up off the bottom. I'm just not going to be directly under the pads. That's another reason you want that heavier weight, like a 1 ounce weight for your PortersYT weight, is because you're not just trying to penetrate the vegetation, but you also need enough weight to drag that bait in behind it to follow. And the bite is pretty much the same as a pitch bite, where you're just going to feel a tick and then the weight of that fish and set the hook as normal. Another nice thing about this technique is the versatility of where you can throw it. You can throw it around docks that have vegetation next to them. You can just go out in open water. As long as there's vegetation, you can use this technique. You can find holes in the grass, drop it down in there, just drop it straight into matted grass. You can work around docks just like you would with a jig or a pitching rig or anything like that. It's just a different look, and it's got enough backbone and stout. When you hook up, you can get those fish out of there. If you tried this with just a drop shot rod, you're going to snap off probably more often than you'd like to, but also you're going to give up just too much leverage to the fish in that grass, and they'll just pop that hook right out and swim off. So just like I would if I was working a dock with a jig, that can go right in there, right on a corner. Now, I know there's grass. You can see the grass under the water. This whole grass surrounding this whole dock. So I can work my way around this thing. Here you've got a log sticking up out of vegetation, and you can work the whole side of this log this way. Now, truth be told, I pitched already the majority of those pads without even so much as a sniff. It's one of those techniques where maybe it's not the go-to technique, but before you leave an area, it's definitely something to try and just see if that doesn't make a difference in triggering a strike. Again, it's something different. It's a different look. It's a suspended bait in among that vegetation, and it's just something they don't see a lot, if at all. It's a technique to keep in your back pocket when stuff gets tough. It's a technique to try maybe during tournaments when stuff's really getting pounded. You're just showing them something different. Give it a shot. It's really easy. Lead weights, 1 ounce, teardrop lead weights. They're inexpensive. Don't bother with anything tungsten or fancy. You just need a hunk of weight to pull your bait down into those pads. That's it. This is not a finesse technique. This is a power fishing technique, and you want to treat it more like a power fishing technique. It's just showing the fish the bait in a subtle way on power equipment.